Welcome to today's webinar on Insider's Look at the IEC 60601 amendments, detailed guidance from the committee member responsible for the changes. My name is Wade Schrader, Medical Device Guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We've got a really special presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter, Leo Eisner, is really looking forward to sharing his insights from his involvement in the development of the IEC 60601 series and providing you with valuable information and recommendations to help you comply with the updated standards. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Eisner Safety Consultants, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 60 minutes with a Q&A session at the end of the presentation where Leo has been kind enough to answer all your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you on today's webinar. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants like Leo Eisner, or through our award-winning quality management software platform. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based, general-purpose quality management systems and are adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. In doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to gain ISO 13485 certification, market approval, breeze through audits, and push beyond just compliance to produce true quality medical devices. So if you're interested in learning how we can help your device company, make sure you visit www.greenlight.guru after today's webinar and schedule your personalized demo. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter today and a longtime partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Leo Eisner. Leo, the IEC 60601 guy Eisner, is the principal regulatory and compliance consultant of Eisner Safety Consultants and has been doing this for 22 years. He is world-renowned IEC 60601 medical electrical equipment expert and is involved in the development of the IEC 60601 series, where he serves on multiple committees, including the Interpretation Committee. He is a US co-chair for SC62D, which is in charge of many of the particular standards, including many for the IEC 60601 series. He recently started working on ISO 15223-1 and will be presenting on this topic later this year. Leo is also a part of the CV Scheme ETF-3 risk management group, and he routinely speaks and writes as an international expert on the IEC 60601 series. Leo and his team have helped countless clients through the compliance and regulatory maze over his career with over 30 years experience. Leo has audited for several EU notified bodies and has been a technical reviewer on medical electrical equipment. He currently does this for NSAI. Leo started his career at UL back in 1985 and worked in a variety of non-medical areas from alarms, ATMs, HVAC, microwaves, computers, plastics, etc. for 9 years, and then found medical devices and never turned back. Without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter, Leo Eisner.
Thanks, Wade. Really appreciate that intro. Let's go on. So first, I want to intro my company a little bit. We provide consulting services for many medical device companies across the board, small, medium, large, doesn't matter to us, will help anyone. We do anything from product safety, which is what we're talking about today, 601 based all across the board, EMC, which is also under 601, risk management, which falls under 601, and more broadly, all types of medical device. Labeling review, which can be under product safety, there's a huge amount, but also more globally. Looking at standards, regulations, laws, guidances. I'm on a ton of standards committees. Design reviews, helping with DHS and tech files or technical documentation now if you're looking under MDR, and training, something like what we're doing today. So let's dive into the presentation. We can talk a little bit about background about what we're doing today with the amendments project and talk a little bit about the timeline, which it was a pretty big project, but not as big as Amendment 1 of 601. And then we're going to talk about the changes for Amendment 2 of 60601-1, which is the general standard, or some call it the base. Then we're going to get into some of the changes for the EM disturbances standard, which a lot of people are still used to calling it the EMC standard, which until very recently, that's what I've been calling it, even though it's been called the disturbances standard since 2014, I believe. And then we'll get into the alarm standard changes very briefly. And then, believe it or not, 4th edition is on the horizon. Not all that far from now, 2024, 2025-ish timeframe. And then we need to look at what are the impacts that you as a manufacturer need to look at for a decision when to start transitioning for the amendments that just came out. So there is a lot of material in this presentation, and what we'll be covering today won't cover all the changes, obviously, in these standards that are just publishing or just published. We have a lot included information, so hold on to your pants and skirts. So Wade, can you put up the polling question?
Yes, it should be up, and we'll give everyone a few moments here to respond.
Okay, so I'm going to read it because I don't see it, so I'm not sure. Is it up?
Yes, it is up.
Okay. Has your company started to plan for the amendments changes? Ah, there. Now I see it.
Nice. And yep, we'll give a few more moments for some people to respond. And I'll go ahead and close the poll. It looks like we have about 26% of people saying yes and 74% saying no.
26% is a little higher than I expected. It's close to what I expected. I expected about 20%. So it's a little better than I expected. So that's good. It's impressive. I expected more like 20%. So that's not too bad, but there's definitely a percentage of people out there or companies that didn't know about the amendments, which isn't terribly surprising because standards keep changing very quickly, is what I see. So my suggestion, which is always, is you need to strategize and plan. And so one thing I suggest is getting copies of the standards and looking at the impact to your company and doing a gap assessment, how that's going to impact your company. And we'll talk about that more later in the presentation. So this slide is just making sure that you know we're talking about, this is the base standard or the general standard. It's actually the general standard is IEC 60601-1, and the scope is basic safety and essential performance of medical electrical equipment and systems. And so it's electrical based devices. can be internally powered, which is battery operated. So this presentation assumes you know the scope of this standard. It's sort of our jumping off point because there's a lot of technical detail in this presentation. If you're not familiar with this standard, don't fret, it's okay. I just did a presentation sort of on the basics of 601, and you can find it on my LinkedIn I did an interview with Munir El Azizi of Easy Medical Device on August 10th, I believe it was, that should explain more of the basics of 60601-1. And my LinkedIn profile is at the end of the presentation, so you can go there and connect with me. Just make sure you say you saw me on Greenlight, because I don't accept every single LinkedIn that I get. So it's just good to let me know that's why you want to connect, and I'll just make it a little easier that way. So what is the Amendments Project? It's all these 8 standards, and I'll get into them in more detail later in the presentation. But this is the general standard, and all of these are collateral standards. But it's not this collateral standard, which is the X-ray. This is EM disturbances, usability, alarm systems, environmentally conscious design, closed loop controllers, home use environments. It's actually home healthcare environment. That's a typo. And the emergency medical services. And the reason for the updates in the short list, which I'll explain in a minute, is the Amendments Project. And it's for these reasons that we looked at. And the short list, I believe all of these are part of the short list, reason list. Oh, there was one other point I wanted to bring up. That's not in the specific slide. So the Technical Committee 62, in charge of the series of standards, has been collecting issues, comments, corrections, questions for probably 10 years now, prior to what's called the Kobe resolution, which is actually this first item in the timeline back in 2015, that have been needing to be updated for reasons including all that list that I just showed. So on the timeline, you can see the project started based on the Kobe resolution. And that's basically was the beginning of the timeline of the project. And we started with 511 items were what we voted on to decide what we're going to do as the Amendments Project, which is officially what's called the short list. And the short list was a whittling down from the 511 items. And that was back in October, I think it was October of 2016. And we met in Frankfurt for 2 days to vote on these 511 items, and we had 3 minutes to vote on each item. It was quite a circus, to put it nicely. And for each item to progress onto the short list, which became the Amendments Project, the longer items are going to end up on the 4th edition project. And we've developed an architecture document, which I'll talk about near the end of the presentation, which is already on its 2nd edition. And to progress onto the short list, we had to have a 2/3 majority of all the national committees sitting in this tiny room in a basement in Frankfurt. It was not a place to be, but that's where we ended up. The outcome of the vote was for the 60601-1 standard, 109 items were considered, only 78 were accepted, and 1 was added in later on, which was the 62368-1 standard was added in later on because we found out there was a need because the 60950 standard, the ITE standard, was phasing out in Europe, and I'll talk about that later in the presentation. For the EMC standard, only 15 items were accepted to the short list. For the usability, only 2 items were accepted. For the alarm standard, 20 items were accepted for the short list. For the closed loop controllers, 13 items. For the home use, 4 items were originally accepted for the short list. 1 was added later on. Don't ask me, I don't remember what it was. Then for the environmentally conscious design standard, which is barely ever used other than in Brazil, no technical changes. And for the EMS standard, which is such a new standard, there were no technical changes either. So this diagram I've used in many different ways over the years, and I modified it a lot for this presentation. But the 601-1 is the general, or what's known as the base standard. I like to call it mothership, because it's the beast. It's almost 500 pages in itself. These are the collaterals, or what's known as horizontal standards, and it applies to a lot of products across the board. Other than these 2 seem to be oddballs, I would say. I don't know why they ended up in the place they did. They almost can be particulars. Particulars are, or sometimes called vertical standards, are specific technologies in a sense. 2-2 is high frequency surgical equipment. 2-24 is infusion pumps. The one I'm a convener of is 80601-2-58, which is a joint standard between IEC and ISO committees. And that's lens removal and vitrectomy equipment. And then there's these oddballs, 60601-4-XX standards, their guidance and interpretations. This one's very important to the amendments project because a lot of the interpretations that came out of this, which are in unaddressed standards, safety aspects in the 601 third edition and proposals for new requirements, because now it's third edition 3.1 and now 3.2. That's why it's proposals for new requirements. This is the interpretations group fed into the amendments project, which primarily is for 601-1, but I think there's even some that fed into 1-11. Excuse me for a sec. So this is a quick summary of some of the changes. So the major changes are in the general standard, the EMC standard, the alarm standard, and the closed loop controller standard. And here are some, this is the big news. The general standard just literally got published, Amendment 2, last Thursday. I was waiting with bated breath when that was going to happen. The 1-8, 1-10, 1-6, 1-9, 1-12, 11 all got published late July, the 22nd and 23rd. The EMC standard still has not been published. Hopefully it might get published still this month, but it looks like on the IEC standards development part of the site, not the what's been published part of the site. Looks like it's going to be in September. It was scheduled for August, but it looks like it got pushed back. And when I talked to the convener that's in charge of the standard, he said August originally to me. And I have a dispute with my associate at UL that I work with on the standards committee. She says 1-3, the X-ray standard, is part of the amendments project, and I politely disagree with her. We have good fun, so it's not a problem. 1-6 is editorial changes. It's just terms and reference standards. So to me, that's not a big deal. As I mentioned, no technical changes for the -9 and -12. There's minor changes in -11, which I'll touch on later. And still in process, the X-ray standard, from what I see on the IEC website, is September of 2021. So it's next year. It's not that far off in relative terms. The amendments project did not include the particulars. they have to wait until all the amendments are updated, other than probably 1-3 for most particulars. There are some particulars that may have to wait for the 1-3 to update, but the particular standards are going to have to wait. Committees will need to update their standards based on the amendments. It could take up to 3 years. Some of them may get them done much quicker, up to a year, probably. And it may impact your transition, depending if you have a product that has one or more particular standards. So the amendments project, we wanted to align with regulatory requirements. And what do we mean by regulatory requirements? ISO 14971, which is the risk management standard, 62304, the software lifecycle standard, and 62366, which now is 62366-1, which is the usability standard. So one thing I sort of disagree with is being to the current regulatory requirements. 62304 is in process of going to second edition, but it's had some major stumbling blocks getting to second edition. And the person running that group has had some major challenges aligning between 62304 and 82304 with software as a medical device. There's been some challenges between that and aligning with risk management, because there's differences between 14971 usage of that and not using risk 14971 with 82304, if I remember right. It's been a while since I've looked at some of that documentation. But basically between A1, which the convention I'm going to use in the rest of the presentation, A1 is what everyone is using to go to testing currently, and A2, which is the new version of 601-1, which literally just got published, so no one's physically probably using it yet, because there's no CB scheme test reports to A2, and there probably won't be for about 6 months roughly, maybe a little more, a little less, because I'm in contact with the person that's working with CB Scheme, the co-convener of ETF3, because I'm on that committee. And I may be involved in some of that development. I don't know yet. So getting all this TRFs up to date and getting all that done is going to impact how we're going to get through this whole process of getting gap assessments done as well, because if you don't have the TRF, it's going to be hard to do a full gap assessment. You can do it, but you're going to be cobbled with having the right tools probably. So these are the standards within the 601 series that align with updated versions of the appropriate updated versions of the regulatory requirements. And these are, you can see these are color coded to the versions of the updated regulatory requirements within the series. Oops, I didn't show it on the right screen, probably. Okay, so now we're going to get into the 601 Amendment 2 changes. So on the normative references, which normative means required, we updated the standards list in our standard 601-1 for Amendment 2. So the red is the new standards, and the blue is the standards that already were there, just we updated the dated references. So the new standards are the optocoupler, and here you'll notice it says 2007 or later, so that means literally the 2007 or later references to that standard. 62133-2 lithium systems is an undated reference, which means how our standard's written, it says the latest version of that standard. So if it changes date outside of our standard, you have to meet the latest version of that standard. But in the requirements, you'll see we're allowed to use 62133 or 62133-2, which we'll talk about later in more detail. And then the ITE computer equipment AV standard, we have this option, which is dated, plus we also have the 60950 standard, and those are dated references. Another thing I want to point out is you'll notice we don't list all the collateral standards, only specific ones that we specifically are concerned with within the 601 standard specifically. So like -9, 10, 11, and 12 are not referenced in this 601-1 standard itself because it's irrelevant to our standard. Okay, so terminology and definitions in clause 3. So we're still in clause 3, actually in clause 3 now, excuse me, not clause 2. We're talking with definitions. We've updated 19 references to 14971. We've aligned with 14971 with risk management. The defined terms have updated to align with the most recent version of 14971, but the 601 standard hasn't updated risk management process at all. So clause 4.2 has not changed, just updated those 14971 references. So no change really. There's no change at all to essential performance. So that's an important thing, because many people have already asked me that question. So again, we're in terms and definitions for clause 3. 4 usability definitions have updated the references. So these 4 definitions have updated, but a key thing is usability is not a normative reference. It's always been informative, meaning it's not a requirement. So one thing we didn't do in 3rd edition amendment 1, and probably in 3rd edition 2, is we never had a bibliography reference. So this time we finally added it in the back, and it's somewhere in the 70th reference, if I remember right. So now we're still in terminology and definitions. So now there's probably 8 or 10 new definitions, and I'm only covering several, not all of them. There's a new definition for electromagnetic disturbance, but this has always been in 4th edition of the EMC standard, or electromagnetic disturbance standard, excuse me. I still slip into that mistake. So it's the same definition, we're just putting it in 601-1 for consistency. And here are a whole bunch of alarm definitions, which will be important for table 2 that I'm going to talk about in a very short while. And that's very important, and you'll see why when we get there. These are the only 2 really new definitions within 601-1 itself. This one deals with the pressure vessel requirements, that we updated some of those requirements, and so this definition aligns with that update. And the safety sign definition, there's a section within clause 7 which deals with labeling and accompanying documents, and one of the requirements is safety signs, which is a section in itself, and that was never a defined term, and it's a significant enough section that we decided we needed to update to make it a defined term instead of an undefined term. And you'll notice that this is all caps. That means it's a defined term in how we are doing things in IEC currently. In the next revision of the standard, I think we're not going to be allowed to have all caps, which is a bummer. I really like that usage. It makes it easier to identify things. Because I know in ISO, you're not allowed to have that, which I think is crazy. Or at least in most cases, I think in 15223, you're allowed to do that in some form, from what I remember. So here's my A1, A2 sort of system, or one way I'm going to do it. So here's that safety sign I was talking about, or one safety sign. So if you see 7010 or 7010 ISO, that's always a safety sign. It's a colored symbol. Excuse me for a sec. So this has been very misused and misunderstood by the test houses because the requirement was written very poorly. It says, requirement was mandatory action, then safety sign required, roughly. So it was misunderstood, written poorly in the standard. So it's not the test house's fault, it's just it was poorly written requirement. So now it got rewritten to, if accompanying document, which could be a user manual, IFU, whatever you want to call it, used as a risk control measure for a risk, then use a safety sign. Well, you shouldn't be using labeling as a risk control measure because that's the poorest level of risk mitigation. It's the least desirable mitigation. You want to design safe design as your top priority for risk control. And if not, use a protective measure. And your least desirable is a warning, a caution, contraindication, something like that. So this is your least desirable means. You want to design in something safe. That is your top priority, and especially in an electrical medical device. So this is a big deal. So instead of using this symbol, you almost always on a medical electrical device, and most medical devices, you're going to have this symbol because of 15223 anyway, and other requirements. And most notified bodies push you into this from what I've seen. So it's likely you're going to have this symbol. And when I've seen medical electrical devices, I see typically both of these symbols because your test house has almost always pushed you into this. And when you have a sterile pack and you have this symbol on it, and then there was the argument, does it have to be black and white with this instead of a blue and white? That became a mess in itself. So I'm glad we finally came to this clarification. There's a really important note in Annex A that you want to read as well. And this clarification is very minor that I'm not going to get into it today, but you should read it as well, of course. There's always lots of notes in my slides. This was a clarification to add the IPOO, saying basically the IP is ingress protection through IEC 60529. And one of the requests that came through the committees is saying, we want this extra IPOO instead of IPXO, IPOX between these two, saying ordinary needs to also be clarified that if you have IPXO, IPOX, also IPOO, all should be not required to be marked. So it was a minor clarification. I said, okay, whatever. I think it all means the same thing. You don't need to mark on the product as a classification. To me, it's tomato, tomato, in a sense. I thought it was a nit myself, but whatever works. So in Amendment 1, the requirements for these two identification marks for on for part of the equipment or off for part of the equipment pretty much ended up in the wrong place in the standard. And that ended up in 742 instead of 741, so we moved it to the right place, the more appropriate place, and we added in the standby symbol, basically is the bottom line for this slide. and you can read more detail when you have more time. And like I said, there's just a lot of information in this presentation, and we don't have the time to get into all the details. So this slide, all I'm trying to say is we went from an undefined term up here to a defined term, and the definition is in 3.154. So here is the famous table 2. So in Amendment 1, this is that tiny little table that we had. Hopefully it's readable enough on the screen for you. Depends on your screen size probably. And here's a whole bunch of different indicator lights of all different sorts. Some flash, some don't probably. And here's table 2 now that it's blown up and a lot more detailed. So here are alarms that got added in that never existed. These 3 rows, high priority, medium priority, low priority, which I mentioned in the definitions section several slides ago. Warnings and cautions existed here, but you can see there's a lot more detail now. There's when it's on, if it's an indicator light, if it's an alarm indicator light, if it's flashing, if it's not flashing, because indicator lights can't flash. Alarm lights should be flashing, except for low priority. And there's all these footnotes, which most of them tie back to 60601-8. The alarm committee is the one that put this all together, and it took them, I think, at least 3 to 4 tries to get this right. It went through lots of revisions with lots and lots of feedback from lots of people and lots of additional info. So you're going to want to take your time going through this. I suspect products that didn't have alarms are going to turn into products with alarms. You're likely going to want to get a copy of 60601-8, and you're really going to want to take your time going through this, and it's going to affect your perspective on alarms. So I think it's a big development, it's a good development, but it may change your perspective on alarms. So this slide talks about that right here. These are IOs, input and output connections, what we call SIP-SOPs in the standard. So we have an update to SIP-SOPs in regard to clause 842. Before we used to measure the voltage, and if the voltages were above a certain amount, then you needed to do a test. And also you have power output connectors. Now the way that A2 deals with it in regard to accessible parts and applied parts is what touches the patient. If the voltage at the SIP-SOPs or the power supply output connectors are less than or equal to 60 volts DC or 42 volts peak, you don't have to do touch current, which is a form of leakage current. And there's a method now, which is this method here, in place for how to make that measurement. And this is EUT would be equipment under test. Sometimes you'll see DUT, which is device under test. What this is telling you is in Amendment 1, we had this diagram in a slightly different format back in the back of the standard in Annex A, which was is the guidance and rationale, and now we made it normative or requirement and put it in figure 40 and modified it. And this section got changed specifically. This also got a little updated, I believe. Excuse me. And we added in specifically the 62368-1, which I'll get into in a minute in more detail with some background and some specific details. And we're in now means of protection, which I will get into more detail as we get into the next couple slides. So let's get into some background in 62368-1. So the ITE standard 60950-1, and I have a typo there, there's an extra one in there. That 01 shouldn't be there, it should be 60950, is disappearing because of the EU low voltage directive. Specifically, at the end of this year, December 20th, goes away. And so the US and Canada is following suit, and I don't know their exact timeframes, but I think it's the end of this year, maybe it's next year with them, will be replaced with 62368-1 third edition, state-of-the-art standard. So it impacted the amendments project, not at the beginning of the project, but it was voted on sometime, I believe in 2018, I think it was in London, and it shifted our project about 7 months. So an ad hoc team that I was a member of met in 2018 and 2019 to formulate requirements and propose to the national committees to integrate into the Amendment 2 project. So we found as an ad hoc team that 62368-1 was not equivalent to 60950 requirements in relation to 601-1. So we can generically accept it as an option to means of operator protection in regard to 60601-1, or also means of patient protection as we look at it from a 601 perspective. So what we had previously in Amendment 1 was 2 means of operator protection from 60950 was equivalent to 1 means of operator protection. So that meant we couldn't just generically plunk in 62368-1 and say it's equivalent to 60950. So we had to do some piecemeal work, and we're going to have to relook at it much closer when we go into 4th edition. So it was quite an effort, and we had to really look at things pretty closely. And so because of that, we have this extensive note, which this is only a very quick summary of it. So does 2 means of operator protection actually equal 1 means of patient protection isolation? And the answer is not always. And so this is going to affect, like, especially switch mode power supplies. And it's even now going to affect 60950 power supplies, not just 62368 power supplies. The big issue is the working voltage. So for 60950 power supplies, when you get up to 707 volts, that's where you're going to have the breaking line, where it's going to be an issue. So your isolation barrier between, say, mains and secondary, once you get up to 707 volts DC or 500 VRMS, for 2 means of protection, operator protection, you're okay. But once you go over that, we can't guarantee it, and you're going to have to look at the tables and determine if it's okay. But for 62368, it's that 354 volts DC or 250 VRMS. For a switch mode power supply, that could be a problem. And so you're going to have to look at your working voltage, your creepages and clearances, which is spacings. So another way to look at this is, if you don't want to have these problems, use a 601 power supply, then you don't have these problems. And the other thing is, this 1 means of protection, if you're going to rely on these power supplies, the 60950 or 62368, and you're not guaranteed this 1 means of protection inside this power supply, you need to design two means of protection elsewhere in your device. If you don't have that, and you go to a test house and you get to the end of the test program and they tell you you don't meet it, you're in trouble. You just lost all those months of testing, potentially, if they don't tell you early on, which some test houses do, some don't. The big issue is it's your responsibility up front to make that isolation diagram and provide it to them. If you didn't do that up front, you've lost a lot of development time as well. It's your responsibility to do that. Some test houses do it for you, and you're making assumptions that it's not really their responsibility to do. So that's something we can help you with if you need that help. We do that all the time for our clients. So continuing with separation of parts in the same clause, actually, optocouplers. This requirement never existed in the standard before, but labs always looked at it, just never quite in this written requirement as the way it is. So if you use a 60747-5-5 IEC opto, then these two clauses just fall out. They say you meet those clauses, how it's written, but you need to comply with these requirements, that the air clearance at the outside of the opto, which is this red line, and the creepage, which would happen to be the same red line, and the dielectric strength across the opto, which is going to pretty much be the same red line. You need to meet those. Excuse me. So let's see, what do we have here? This is a cleanup clause, and it's similar to what was 2 slides ago. So added the requirements, same as 852 from 2 slides ago. Added 60950, just the reference from non-dated to dated. Went from no 62368 to added 62368, and some details. So I'm not going to get into more details on this slide. You can look at it when you get your copy of the standard. So this test method basically was added to clarify the test method to measure the appropriate working voltage, which is this UW here up in the corner, if I can get my mouse to work. Up here, UW is the working voltage across this isolation barrier from mains to secondary, typically, is what this is supposed to represent. This guidance came out of the working group, or the working group 14, which is the interpretation committee. The information was provided in the standard to conduct these measurements consistently, since it wasn't in there. And here is case 1 and case 2, where case 1 is where you provide one means of protection for a floating circuit. So that means this would not be connected to ground. And case 2 is where you don't have a means of protection between here and here, so it's a floating circuit. And this is actually the item that I submitted to the committee for consideration, because I had a client that came to me, God, it must be at least 7 or 8 years ago now, probably longer than that, probably closer to 10 years ago, that went to a lab. The lab kept testing and failing and testing and failing, and they finally threw up their hands and they came to me and said, I'm really frustrated with the lab. What can we do? We looked at it and said, the lab's testing this wrong. And we finally convinced the lab that we argued for a while and finally came up and said, they're testing it wrong. We figured out that it was an issue. Basically, they had one applied part with multiple leads in close proximity, but it was inside the body. So it was basically fluid path with one set of leads so close together that was conductive, you needed to consider it as one applied part. So you can't do these two tests in that format and really call it a legitimate test. So we had to write a proviso in the standard said, this doesn't make sense to do, because it wasn't written in the standard clear enough that the test lab knew that wasn't okay to do. So we had to explain it to the lab. They finally agreed. And so I submitted that in and it got accepted, and then it got reworded and reworded and reworded many times before it actually became text in this update. So detachable power supply cords has always been a bugaboo with test labs and being tested consistently. And so this part of the standard has been a bit of a challenge. And so it's been updated and hopefully it'll be better. Hard to know. We'll see how it pans out because testing is always, there's always little glitches. So now the manufacturer has two options. You can either provide power cords for testing, which would mean you need to provide each version of the power cord if you have different power cords, lengths, currents, cross-sectional areas, etc., unless you maybe can prove equivalence, which I don't know what the test labs are going to do with that. This could be costly and add time potentially to testing. Or you can specify in the accompanying documents. But one thing I realized after reading this over and over again, it's not clear if they're asking what the accompanying documents means. Is it in the IFU, the technical description, or some other specification it is acceptable? It's not clear how it's written in the requirements. At least I'm not sure if it's clear. I want to ask some more questions. And I was part of the group that wrote that in MT28. So I'm partially guilty if it's unclear. I'll admit it. Internally powered equipment, which is battery operated, basically is what that means. So this is measuring circuits. So this ends up being the leakage current test diagrams for internally powered equipment. In second edition, there were diagrams for leakage current for power, battery operated devices, basically. Third edition disappeared. 3.1 didn't exist. 3.2 are sort of so-so decision was, well, we didn't have time to come back with all the diagrams updated from second edition to 3.2, so we did it in words. So that's the best we came back with. So this diagram, we updated the mistake we did here, and in here, the note is to be aware that there's some very significant updates with 62368-1 to be aware of if you're dealing with voltages with means of patient protection, for the one means of patient protection. For conductive surface coatings, to be aware of, there are this is a new requirement, and test houses have been aware of this requirement for years, have requested it, and usually asked for in the US, UL 746C. I used to work in the group back at UL about 25, 30 years ago as a low-level manager, so it's nothing new in most test houses, even internationally. There's ISO standards. So most test houses are aware of this, and it deals with flaking and peeling, reducing spacings is the concern. So it's this material here can flake off because it's on a plastic. It's for EMC conductive coating, basically, to reduce EMC escaping a plastic enclosure. got a lot to cover still, so I'm gonna have to fly. So on this fire enclosures, we reduced the requirement for insulated wire and connectors. We added connectors to this requirement, and FV is a misnomer, it should be V. And we went from V1 down to V2. Here we kept the V2 at the same rating and changed from connectors, PCBs, insulating materials to PCBs and insulating materials. This one, we went from bottom openings, busy, confusing paragraph here to same wording, just reformatted it. This is side openings, and this was the requirement plus this figure, and the figure had a bunch of wording, and we made it similar to the bottom openings and just reworded it to make it easier to read, and added these two requirements to add some flexibility, and then added a risk management clause for additional options. So more flexibility, basically. Usability and alarms. Usability, I'm not going to talk about later in the presentation. We went from undated to dated specific, so we can move in lockstep as the standards change over time. We will keep just dated references for collaterals in the future. At least that's our edict at this point, and same with any other collaterals. And references to collaterals in the front of the standard, here are the references here. This was an interesting discussion. This was in the non-electrical group. This was the thermal hazards group, which I'm also in. And so table 23 is now dealing with accessible parts instead of likely to be touched. So we updated table 23 and added a new table 34. So you can see normal use and abnormal use. And this is really a good table that we added in. So table 23 is for normal use when you are intending to touch the product to operate it. And table 34 here is when you are operating the device but touching the product but not intending to touch it to do so. So in a single fault, short term, and if you look here closely, you'll see less than 1 second scenario. And these temperatures here are much higher than these temperatures in the 1 second realm. And we expanded this list a little bit versus this time set of materials. We just blew up this list a little bit. So look at the tables and the limits for the higher temperatures. So it's an interesting, so this is in 13.1.2, I think is where it is, versus this is in 11.1.1 and 13.1.2 is this table, and this table's in 11.1.1. So different areas of the standard. So lithium batteries. So it used to be only in A1 62133, the old lithium battery standard. Now you have the option of either 62133 or 62133-2, which is the updated standard. So I have seen several clients I've dealt with that have been pushed either by regulators, vendors, or customers requiring the new standard already. And so the implications are you need a new CB cert, you're going to have additional test costs, additional test samples, potential project delays, potential redesign of the batteries and or the battery packs to meet these new requirements. So there's implications you need to think about if you're going to go up to the new standard. You do have the flexibility of either still in the standard. Okay. EM disturbances, the updated standard. So we went from conducted emissions, 1 voltage, to min and max voltage, no impact on single volt devices. Immunity to proximity magnetic fields, an FDA added requirement, is what I understand is they're the ones that added it in. And test method in 61004-39 that's the test method. It's based on an AIM standard, which there's not many test labs that do it, and a couple frequencies. And there's one home healthcare environment test specifically, and Annex F has been rewritten, and it's a much easier and better to understand Annex F than the previous one. The alarm standard, and I'm going to go through this one very quickly. In clause 3 of the standard, we've changed low, medium, and high priority definitions. There's a huge bunch of new defined terms, and I did not finish the list because there's so many. There's some new tones. In clause 6, auditory alarm signals, Annex G has new sound files, which are optional currently, but note that the Alarms Committee is considering making them mandatory in the next revision of the standard. 13 ISO 3744 was incorrectly referenced previously, so that's been updated and could impact your testing. Clause 611.1 was updated to include distributed information systems. Like I said, that was a mouthful, but I have to get through things very quickly at this point to keep relatively on time. Home healthcare environment changes. So this is an Annex A, general guidance and rationale, but it's really important to be aware of. So this clause in Annex A infers ingress of liquids or parts rated for operating wet. Liquid shouldn't accumulate or drain away. It should drain away, basically. So it shouldn't interfere with basic safety or essential performance. It shouldn't deposit on insulation parts or track on creepage, and it shouldn't reach live parts, including internal power sources, which are batteries, basically, or windings designed to operate when wet. So it shouldn't get wet. Basically, to me, this sort of comes down to IEC 60529, which in ingress protection testing, the updated version of that standard basically says a lot of this, just not quite in these terms. And I've had a couple clients that have argued with labs, some successfully, some not so successfully. And so now I think it's much clearer in the back of the standard. This is an important clarification, even though these are minor changes from what everyone's saying, this is not so minor to be aware of. So this one is very clear, cut and dry. Basically, if you have internal power source battery connected to mains power supply, you need to have 2 means of protection from the mains to the patient applied part. Cut and dry, no question. This one is not so clear, but it's a good clarification. If you have internally powered device like this battery, and this is a stimulator product, it's a Boston Scientific spinal stimulator, but this is the battery, and this is a charger, and this is not connected to the patient anymore, not being intended for medical function. It's not touching the patient. Say this is being charged overnight. It's now being used by the operator, not the patient anymore. It's sort of a phony use of the patient still touching it, but it's not the patient using it. It's, quote, the operator in the home use environment. Now you don't need patient protection, but operator protection, which is a level less stringent than patient. So it's a technicality. so the isolation requirement's less. My solution is if you use a 601 power supply, you have the highest level of protection, then you don't have to worry about operator because you're using patient protection. That's the way you get around it. Fourth edition on the horizon. I'm trying to get through this really quick at this point. Okay. Earliest start date for the project, 2024, but likely it will be delayed. Some ideas looking at for the architecture of this. One requirement shall statement. Keep it short and sweet. And also it'll be easier for design specs. Write clear, less interlaced complex requirements. Again, better for design specs. Use clear testable requirements. So it'll be easier for design specs. Make it easier for those designing the products. Integrate some collaterals into 601-1, like what we have for system requirements that came from the -1-1, etc. Possible database standards. So instead of having 6 or 8 or 10 standards that you're using for your product, say your infusion device, which has however many standards you have to combine together, it's all integrated into one. It'll make it easier to design your product because what takes precedence over what is not always so easy to decide. So that's the concept. The question that I keep bringing up is the small manufacturer. How are they going to afford a database standard over buying separate standards, which that has not been resolved. I do want to bring up 1 or 2 other points real quick. The IMDRF has been involved to some extent. Mostly it's been the FDA in the development through IMDRF, and that's been the Standards and Conformity Assessment Group of the FDA. They'd like more involvement, but that just hasn't happened yet. Factors that may impact the decision for transition, and I'm going to have to fly through this. I wish I had a little more time, but I think we're pushing time here. So what things are going to impact that? We've talked about particular standards, so I'm not going to talk much about that. When will national standards adopt the amendments? I found out yesterday from AMI, which is the US National Standards Organization, will likely publish the US adoptions of 601-1, 1-2, 1-8, 11, and 12 around spring of 2021. I don't know about other countries because I just haven't found out yet. Transition dates of national certifiers such as UL, CSA, BSI. Wish I had some information, too early to know. National regulator transition period timelines. From my buddies at the FDA, again, from the same group, Standards and Conformity Assessment Group, they're telling me fall, but would have liked to recognize the whole series of standards, including the particulars. I've had to tell them the same information I told you today. So they're going to adopt probably the 3-year transition period that's recommended in the standards at the front of, in the forward of the standards. Manufacturers' regulatory approvals, that's sort of up to you what your time cycles are on that. Design timelines, that's again up to your timelines. I've never seen anything shorter than 6 months, and that's really short. Usually it's a year, year and a half, 2-3 years, depending on your product and your design cycles. Your safety certifications, again, it sort of depends on your cycles and times and what relationships you have with your certifiers. New products being ready for market, legacy product lines, and these are only some of the things that are going to impact you. There's other things. I didn't list everything. What are your business, regulatory, quality system strategies and impacts? And there's a lot of things below that that you need to think about too, obviously. When will you start a full gap assessment? Sounds like some of you have started to think about this already, which is great. I think more of you probably need to start thinking about that as well. What are the consequences of all the changes that can impact your design? Resubmission of regulatory approvals, especially over in Europe. Resubmission of safety test house approvals. Realize the TRFs are not ready yet. They haven't even started yet. Until the standards are fully published, then the IEC, the CB scheme, has to then put them in their system, and then the TRFs have to be published, and each of the originating test houses have to adopt them and then start writing them, and that takes time. It's going to be probably 3 to 6 months for each standard to have a TRF updated, and for 601-1, it's going to be probably 4 to 6 months, including the risk management part of the TRF. And probably in the next couple months, hopefully, my group will have a gap assessment available for sale for 601-1 and 1-2. Hopefully we'll have some others, but those are the two we're going to focus on first. And now back to you, Wade.
Awesome. Thank you, Leo. That was fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed that, and I know quite a few other people did too. We've had a ton of questions coming in about whether the slides will be available and the recording available as well. And so just wanted to follow up quickly on all of those questions and say that yes, you will receive an email with a copy of these slides as well as the recording of today's webinar. So yeah, thank you again, Leo. That was awesome. It brought me back to my 60601 days. I know we were talking about that earlier. And
I'm sure.
John might need to watch out. I'm getting the itch to go back to electrical engineering here.
I don't know about that with John.
Yeah, this was fantastic, and definitely I really enjoyed all of your graphics in here as well. That was really helpful. I know we don't have too much time for questions here, but definitely thank you for taking that extra time to cover all that stuff at the end. That was really helpful as well. So I will fit in one question here. It's just there was quite a few people that asked it. So the question is, will the technical committees be publishing red lines to show the changes to the IEC 60601 standards?
Wow, that was one of my gripes to the IEC central office. So, oh my God, I want that recorded and sent over to the central office. So I wrote actually a gripe email to the secretariat about that specific question. So you're not the only one asking that question. So the answer I got back from central office is we don't issue red lines for amendments, was the specific answer I got back. Because the red lines were written by the editor within our group, and I asked for copies of that before they got published, and I was told we can't have them.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like blown away because there was a huge amount of effort put into that, obviously. And no, there's only consolidated versions, which means it shows in black ink that it's consolidated from the first edition, whatever edition it is, plus Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 of 60601-1, and then same for whatever it's 1-2 plus Amendment 1 and all the other amendments of the other collaterals.
Okay. Yeah.
So right now there are no red lines available that I'm aware of. I had an argument about this with associate at UL on one of the versions, and she said, "Yeah, I found a red line." I said, "Of what edition?" And I've looked on the IEC website up and down, and I cannot find any red lines.
Yeah.
She said, "I found it on IHS," and I said, "No, you didn't. If someone finds a red line, let me know. I want to know about it."
Yeah, that would be fantastic. And I guess if there's no red line available, that's just the gap assessment then would be even that tool that you were talking about will be even that much more valuable without those red lines. So
Yeah, I
definitely
guess
looking forward to
so.
that. Yeah, yeah,
Well, I'm
definitely looking
working
forward to
off
that.
my committee drafts because I have the FTISs, which are just before publication.
Oh, nice, nice.
Well, that's part of being a committee member, that's all
Yeah,
those years of hard work and paying all those membership dues.
yeah, it's paying off now.
I guess so. My wife may not agree with all that, or my kids.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fair.
We
Um,
have time for a few more questions.
okay, yeah, I guess we can try to fit some in here. So, um, with the there's one here. Does the lack of TRFs, how is that going to work with ongoing certifications? And yeah, go ahead.
So ongoing certification. So realize that the standards have in every country have not transitioned to the new versions yet. So you're still testing to the what everyone's been testing to. So it's not an issue if you think about it. So everyone's still testing to 60601-1 Amendment 1. They're not testing to Amendment 2 yet because no one's requiring it regulatory wise. So it's not an issue.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
have TRFs that exist for the existing version of the standard that everyone's been testing to. And if you look at China, China in general, unless you're a big company or someone that has sway with China, has been testing to an older version than Amendment 1 typically. There are some companies that do test, and I know China just in the last couple of months, I think, have updated a lot of their standards recently.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it sounds like even after those TRFs are finalized, there's still going to be time after that as well. So
Oh yeah,
we have
there's
some time.
so
Yeah.
like the FDA, their their record. So the other thing, as Scott at FDA has clearly uh, written to me fairly recently, last couple of weeks, I think, he said, standards are recognized, but recognition is a voluntary process. So you don't have to follow our voluntary process. It's voluntary. It's up to you if you want to follow what we recommend. It's not mandated, and it's in law that it says it's not mandated. And he even wrote out where in the code it says that. And I couldn't pull that out and send it out if someone wants that.
Hmm.
Most people that are regulatory people know that recognition is a voluntary process.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and then here's another question, which this one really intrigues me because when you were talking about the fourth edition there, I was getting really excited about all those upcoming things. So with that, you mentioned 2024 will be kind of is that going to be when you start working on it, or is that going to be when it's potentially being released?
Start, and it's probably not going to start in 2024. It's probably going to the starting of the development. So the architecture document we've already been working on for several years now. Because let's see, I think we started on that in London. So that's 2018. So 2, 3 years ago, we started on that. I'm not on the committee because it's more executive level than where I'm at within the organization.
Hmm.
But I've had feedback into it from the US level. But yeah, yeah. So the architecture of the document, we've had, lots of feedback into it already, but the actual fourth edition project's not gonna launch as a standards committee document till at least 2024, 2025, at least. I think it's going to be later than that because I don't think all the particulars are going to be done for third edition Amendment 2 or the amendments project per se until, I don't think that's all going to pan out until 2024.
Okay.
Because we have to get all of that done first before we launch into the next round.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, don't want to start on the next one before the first one's.
No, everything has to be lined up at this point. Otherwise, we're going to have a disaster. And we agreed with that years ago. We agreed with that back in New Orleans, which was, I'd have to look back at my notes to remember what year that was.
Okay.
I think that was like 2012 or something.
Okay. Yeah, so definitely still a ton of questions here. Definitely we'll have a lot for you to follow up on. I think one last one maybe here, but before we end it here, and there's a lot of just general questions about. It seems like the Second Amendment's going to align a lot closer with 14971, 62366, 62304. Can you talk a little bit about how it still differs from 14971, how the risk still differs from 14971, and usability still differs a little bit from 62366?
So the big thing is that 601 as a general series of standards is a type test standard, so it's not a process standard. So the difference is that we're not looking at the full life cycle like those standards are. So we're not looking at post-production issues. So we're not looking at the full process like those three standards do. So we don't look at all the post-production issues. We cut it off at that point. So we don't look at the feedback issues.
Yeah.
And that's stated in all of our standards, or most, any of the standards that call in 14971, 62366, or 62304 is different because we deal with that a little more in a different way though. And I'm not as familiar with 62304 because I don't deal with software much.
Yeah.
Or to the extent that I know 62304.
Mm-hmm. And someone did even mention that your assessment of 62304 earlier in the presentation was correct. So you got that going for you.